Sarah K. Brown. Welcome to the space.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm super pumped you're here and the conversation that I know will come from this. For anybody who does not know you, who are you today?
I today am living a great balanced life. I'm excited. I have kind of a nice split today of both like singing voice clients for singing lessons, but I also have a couple clinical cases today too.
Yes,
So it's fun because I get to wear both hats. And also it's Friday. So there's just like that Friday energy around the whole thing
I love it.
as well. So yeah, so it feels like a good day.
I love it. In terms of these hats, what are they specifically?
Mhm. So I am a licensed speech pathologist, and I got my career started that way clinically, working in the city at a voice center, doing mostly voice rehabilitation. But in the last couple of years, I've gone into private work, and I do a lot of just straight up singing, teaching, and singing lessons now, which is such a fun, like, creative way of using my clinical skill set. So the hat I wear most of the time now is actually as a singing teacher. But the clinical cases are really fun because when I do get them, they still are usually singers and usually professional level. And so lately, it's been a lot of fun work doing some like vocal health consulting for people pre-contract, if they're taking on a big
Mhm.
role, making sure that we've got all their vocal health stuff checked out before they go on the road for something like that. And then also a couple just rehabilitative clinical patients too, who are professional level singers who are coming out of an injury of some kind. And yeah, I have a little bit of both, just fun. A lot of my days are probably, 90% singing teaching, but today it's a little more 50-50. And it's kind of nice to get to wear both of my hats today.
Yeah. When you went into this as a profession, did you know that the singing teacher part of it was something you wanted to eventually use your credentials for?
I think getting into singing teaching was definitely the plot twist because when I left opera school and felt like I'm not ready to sing professionally, I'm going to go into speech pathology and kind of make this my day job while I sort of still train my singing voice, but I'm really going to invest in like speech pathology as a career. And even when I got to Mount Sinai, I was working clinically there. I really enjoyed it and liked it, and a lot of people do that career forever. Like that just is
Yeah.
their job, and they stay there. And I never thought that I would get into singing teaching. I say it kind of like happened by accident, sort of.
How? What
And
happened?
yeah, well, I think a part of it was the pandemic a little bit, just because I did start social media education during the pandemic, honestly, because I was bored and locked
Yeah.
in my apartment in New York City. I wasn't allowed to leave New York City because of the clinical work. And there was a lot of misinformation online about vocal health. And so I thought, I have all this time. Why not just use this as a creative outlet? And I think building that platform definitely opened the door to taking on private clients in general. So I started with like professional speaking clients and more speaking focused people.
Yeah.
But that eventually turned into like the occasional singing student. Who was kind of just doing it for fun. But I happened to pick up one private singing student who was referred to me because of vocal health reasons. They were coming off of a vocal health thing, and so they were referred to me, and they were professional level, and it went really well. They referred a few of their friends referred a few friends, and that's how it developed into being so professional level focused was from
Yeah.
that one referral source. But yeah, I say it was kind of by accident because I never would have expected it to happen and I
Yeah.
didn't set out for it to happen. I just wanted to focus on singers in the clinical setting. That was definitely a passion and an interest, but I never thought it would turn into actual like singing teaching instead of
Yeah.
just the rehab.
Yeah, I think, as a vocalist who has suffered a vocal injury, which I feel is even just taboo to say out loud.
Yeah, I
Um,
feel you,
yeah, which
which is a
I want to
shame
get
that it's that
into.
way, but
Yeah, and we should get into
yeah.
that for sure. There's definitely a fear that I have around finding the person with whom I feel most
Yeah.
comfortable moving forward given my background. And my first voice lesson was when I was 7, and I'm not going
Oh
to
my
age myself
God.
now. So I've
Oh my God.
been
When you were 7?
when I was 7. Yeah,
That's so precious.
it's very precious in that, like, my parents put me in piano lessons. I didn't wanna practice. To this day, I'm like, "How dare you? What kid wants
Oh,
to practice? Nobody wants to practice. You should
yeah.
get
Nobody
there." It's
wants to
like the biggest
practice.
thing. But I would sing all the time from when I could speak, and I
Yeah.
clearly loved
Oh.
that, and they put me in voice lessons, and it obviously stuck. And over the course of
Yeah.
my life, I've had multiple vocal teachers, many of whom I
Yeah,
stayed with for many years, but under,
totally.
the guidance of whatever happened, I had this injury, and it has
Yeah.
still to this day, it's in my bones, so like a fear, a deep fear.
Yeah.
And I would imagine this one, professional student who came to you probably had something in their own version of whatever that
Yeah.
was. And when it comes to an injury of your literal well being and also
Right.
livelihood,
Right.
you take that seriously. So it makes a lot of
Yep.
sense to me that they referred and then that thing spiraled, because you trust when you see a person who, takes control of their career and trusts a team to help
Yeah,
them rehabilitate,
totally.
and people then flock to those people out of trust.
Yep.
So very real,
Yeah.
very, very
Yeah,
real.
totally. And what's been interesting is I think that, like, as much as I'm getting people now who are coming out of injury, I think that it's spiraled into, like, proactive
Preventative.
referrals,
Mhm.
which I
Great.
really think that's great, actually. I mean, the best care for your voice is as proactive as possible and preventative as possible.
Mhm.
Of course, as a professional singer, the risk for injury is always there. I mean, just like a professional athlete could injure their knee really easily in a sport game, it's kind of similar, that risk level. But I think that the people who are now taking a lot of care to like preventatively consult with a speech pathologist, like singing person, I think that piece has been something also I didn't expect to happen.
Yeah.
So that's been cool to see.
Yeah. I'd love to talk to you about the stigma around it, just from
Oh,
you
yeah.
being in the world. I know, from the performer perspective, it seems like slowly and surely people are slowly talking a little bit more about it, because they tend to be on the other side of it, where they're like, look, I had this and
Right.
look at me now, I'm totally cool. And
Right.
and but when somebody's going through it, there definitely is this
Yeah.
shame around the fact that, this thing that I built my entire career upon, or I'm
Yeah.
reliant upon, is now, and
Uh,
I've been trained in for years, and I've been
right.
focusing very
100%.
specifically on building, is not
Totally.
sustaining me, or has failed me, or I failed myself, or I didn't. There's so much
Right.
internal shame and external shame.
Oh god.
I'd love to
Yeah.
hear, yeah, like as you work with clients who are either navigating that or
Mhm.
hoping to prevent that, or even just like from within
Totally.
it, from a clinical perspective, what can we do to either combat it or help it, or just that whole, let's just talk in that and see
Let's
where we go.
open that box.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, a lot of things come to mind with that question. I mean, I think the first and foremost, like, most important thing is that I deeply wish that there was less stigma around vocal injury.
Yeah.
And so anything that I can do or say publicly to encourage people to take that stigma out of it, I feel very passionately about that. I think,
Mhm.
um, people so equate it with, their voice is their identity, and then on top of that, they're like,
Yes.
"Oh, well, I got injured, I must have done something wrong, and my
Yes.
technique must be horrible, and it must be my fault," and it kind of quickly becomes this shame spiral, and I think
1,000%.
that shame spiral totally gets in the way of the recovery process too,
Mhm.
and so, yeah, anything that we can do to just, like, really encourage performers that, like, there does not have to be this stigma around vocal injury. It's
How do we
really
do that
common.
though? Just like
I
how
know.
is it just really
That's
telling,
yeah.
like, the data of, like, actually these are how many people have them? Like, what, how do we begin to show people
Yeah.
that it's not that it's not a big deal, but, like, that many people
Right,
have
it's a
them all
big
the
deal,
time?
but it's very common. I mean, I think, and this is something I should be better about in terms of just actually looking up statistics and percentages and see what the research says in terms of that. I do think there was one study that found they looked at, I think it was all voice teachers and our professional level singers, and they found that like 76% of them
Wow.
had slight irregularities on their vocal folds, and they weren't even people who felt like they were having a problem, for
Yeah.
example. So I mean, it's really common that any professional level singer is not going to have a textbook larynx, most likely, anyways,
Mhm.
and not going to have perfectly straight chords or perfectly symmetric chords. So just knowing that at baseline, most larynxes aren't perfect, especially with a normal amount of wear and tear you're going to get as a professional singer, they're probably not going to look perfect. And
Mhm.
I actually personally think, and I do think there are some others in the clinical community who would agree with me, that some of the wear and tear you develop as a professional singer probably actually helps you make the sounds that you make. I think the vocal folds sort of like adapt and make these compensatory shapes that help you make the sounds that you make. And so, if anything, not only do you not need to have perfect vocal cords to sing well, some slight change on your vocal cords actually might help you do what you do at the level that you do it at. And so I think just knowing that like you don't need to have perfect vocal cords is probably a first big step of taking
Okay.
down that stigma. I think what's kind of complicated about the whole conversation around it is, while I don't want any of my patients to go into a shame spiral over having an injury, we also, like, two things can still be true at the same time. We still do have to evaluate, how did this happen?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's something like you saying you're being sick and you were on a contract and you didn't really have a choice. And like that's kind of a different situation than, oh, I went to a sporting game and screamed a bunch and then I had a vocal fold hemorrhage. That's a different onset. And
Yeah.
so we do have to be like, you can't scream at a sporting event. Like
Yeah.
that's just not good for your voice. So
Yeah.
it's like two things can be true. I don't want you to have a ton of shame about it, but we also have to like be honest with, how did we arrive here? And sometimes it's a bunch of little things over a long period of time that set someone up for that, whether it's like singing through chronic allergies, singing a role that's really, really intense and not having the speaking voice training for that role. And then, 8 months of that over time, just kind of one day, it's like, oh, I'm actually realizing now that this is affecting me in a way that I maybe
Hmm.
saw little bits of signs of this along the way, but now it's actually becoming a problem. Yeah. So all that to say, we don't want to shame spiral. We don't want to catastrophize things, but we do have to truthfully look at like, how did we get here so that we can help get you out of it. And
Yeah.
so those things can be true at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think also what's tricky about the stigma part of it, and why I think a lot of people don't talk about it as it's happening, is we don't always know the full extent of it as it's happening. And
Yeah.
so I can kind of understand why some people would keep it on a need to know basis, because we don't know what it's going to look like. I mean, you could be diagnosed with nodules and still be singing on Broadway 8 shows a week, and
Hmm.
we work around it. Like, that is possible. It's also possible that you hemorrhage and we need to actually take 2 weeks off and be on mostly voice rest with some rehab exercises along the way or something like that. So I can understand why it's sort of on a need to know basis in the short term, just because we don't know what it's going to look like. And saying like, I have an injury might signal a level of catastrophe that's actually not proportional to the situation.
Hmm.
You can do a lot with cords that are a little injured and
Yeah.
still have them recover and still be doing it safely. And so I think, to me, it does kind of make sense why people more talk about it publicly after the fact, because then they can talk about the whole journey
Yeah.
rather than having, not knowing what it's actually going to be along the way. I think also knowing too that like, there's a lot of vocal injuries that don't require surgery. I think that also would help a little bit with the stigma too, and the fear around a
Yeah.
vocal injury is, people think, oh, I have a vocal injury, like I'm going to have to get surgery, and that's not always true. Sometimes
Yeah.
it is, but just knowing too that there's a lot that can be done behaviorally, I think helps take the catastrophe level down
Hmm.
off of it. Yeah, so those are some of my initial
I
thoughts
love
when
that.
this question comes up.
Yeah. I mean, what are the common, I mean, this is, every voice is different, every larynx is different, every human
Yeah.
being and their patterning and how they live their lives is different. But what are some of the more common injuries? We can put that on like a
Mhm.
gradient of catastrophe, but like what are
Totally.
the common ones that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I think in especially in performers, if we're talking about injuries, we're talking about phonotraumatic injuries for the most part. That means phono meaning voice, traumatic meaning trauma, so some kind of actual trauma to the vocal cords themselves causing an injury. That is different than, there are other types of voice disorders where like muscle tension can get really out of whack and cause symptoms, but there's no injury. There can be neurological voice disorders too, like a partial paralysis of one of the vocal cords called a paresis, and those are kind of a separate category.
Mhm.
Those don't happen from wear and tear. Versus these phonotraumatic injuries happen from wear and tear. And I think these are the ones that performers are doing their best to prevent, and are the ones that feel, I think, more catastrophic and a little bit scary and are more common among
Mhm.
performers just because of how much they use their voice. And these all exist on a spectrum. I think a lot of professional voice users will have some, what we would call like mid-third fullness of the vocal cords, meaning like instead of the vocal cords being like perfectly straight, there's just a little bit of fullness in the middle part of them.
Mhm.
If that is left unchecked for a long period of time and it's like progressively getting bigger and bigger and harder, that can turn into something like nodules.
Mhm.
Over time, there's other terms for those midfold lesions, like pseudocyst is one, or polyp is another one. So depending on like the shape of it, a doctor might call it a different name. But
Mhm.
those kinds of lumps and bumps pop up usually in the middle of the cords. Those are the ones that I think singers are really scared of, and
Yeah.
I actually think a lot of singers have very early signs of them. It's just that it's not getting worse, so it's fine.
Yeah.
It's when they get worse enough that it runs into an issue. Those are more of a like chronic phonotrauma injury. So, for example, to get those kinds of lumps and bumps, usually it's from a longer period of time of too much voice use, too loud of voice use, or too tense of voice use, versus something like a vocal hold hemorrhage is usually from a one off. So, like, again, that's screaming at a sporting match, or you are sick and then we're coughing like crazy.
Yeah.
Sometimes that can cause a hemorrhage. It's like that bleed, like a bleeding blood vessel essentially in the
Hmm.
vocal cords. And that kind of vocal injury, usually it's an immediate vocal rest within some gentle vocalizing. That's the kind of injury that you would need to call out of a show immediately if that happened, versus something like being diagnosed with like mild or early stage nodules. You wouldn't necessarily need to call out of a show, but you would need to start some lifestyle modifications quickly, but
Hmm.
you wouldn't need that complete vocal rest. So that's probably the range of like catastrophe would be, do I need to
Yeah.
call out tonight or not?
Yeah.
The hemorrhage you need to call out. They're like kind of lumps and bumps early stages, not necessarily, but probably lifestyle changes right away.
Yeah. I'm gonna ask these questions as like
Yeah,
say I were a newbie who, is
totally.
deciding to I've, assuming I've gone through my, education and I'm actually am assuming
Yeah,
because I have not checked my vocal cords yet, that I
gotcha.
am graduating college and, I'm entering into the professional workforce.
Hmm.
What are my plan of what do I need to be doing? Do I need to immediately find, an ENT or a laryngologist
Hmm.
and like get my vocal cord swabbed so I have a baseline? Do I need to find a say speech pathologist so that I can
Hmm.
see where I'm at in terms of, how I'm speaking and how I'm singing and what I need to be working on? Is it finding myself a voice teacher and,
Hmm.
see, what am I doing and at what rate am I doing it? And I know everybody's different, but from your
Yeah, totally.
suggestion, how are we building ourselves a team? Where are we starting?
Hmm.
What's the chicken or the egg? When do
Totally.
we start this? And when is too early or when is too late?
Totally. So I would say if we're doing the case where you like just graduated college and are moving to the city, I think the second you get into the city, you need to have a voice care team established. And when I say voice care team, I mean a healthcare team, specifically the laryngologist. I
Mhm.
think you need to get a baseline scope exam done again because most professional level singers have some changes on their vocal cords and that's normal for them. And
Yeah.
so to get that baseline of what you feel like when you're feeling good, you are feeling healthy, have your cords looked at. So then we have that baseline to compare it to if you run into a problem. That way we know what's normal for you and what's not, and we don't accidentally misdiagnose something that was actually already there and was not a
Mhm.
problem. So I would say that laryngologist evaluation is probably the most important first thing that I would have set up, because once you have that care established, the second you run into a problem, it's also going to be much easier for you to get in with that person because
Yeah.
you already are an established patient. It's so much harder to get a new appointment with somebody than it is to get a follow up appointment.
Yeah.
And so I think having that taken care of first is the biggest thing. Then I probably would recommend getting set up with a voice teacher, probably next. And this is assuming you are feeling healthy, for the
Yeah.
record. This is assuming you're not feeling any symptoms. I would get set up with a voice teacher, maybe sample with a few different ones, and that can be a conversation for later, but
I do
maybe
wanna
sample
pin that.
with
A
you.
1,000%
Yeah.
wanna pin that. Yep. Mhm.
Yep. So take a sample with a few different teachers and kind of see what's a good fit for you. Get that established, and they hopefully, if they're a high level teacher working in New York, they should have a decent ear for kind of like screening anything major to their ears. There's a couple like telltale signs that you just get used to hearing if you're concerned about someone's vocal cords, and so they can be sort of an extra set of ears on kind of just how your technique and speaking and stuff is going at like a screening level. Um, Once you're set up with them, then I don't know that you necessarily need an evaluation with a speech pathologist right then. I think at that stage in your career, that should be kind of enough. You have your laryngology team set up, you have your voice teacher set up, and then if you run into an issue, that's where the speech pathologist likely is going to get roped in. Now, where I do think that at least my private practice is developing kind of a different, like a proactive version of speech pathology is specifically that pre-contract work. So like,
Mhm.
let's say someone booked a national tour, they're doing the lead, and they're going to be moving not only to an HO week, but also around the country and with all
Right.
these allergies and all these seasonal changes.
Yeah.
That would be a time, I think, to definitely do some proactive speech pathology work, like when we have a functional goal to work on. If
Okay.
you're pretty healthy and not having symptoms with your speaking voice or with your singing voice, it's not going to be super motivating to do a bunch of speech pathology work because we don't have necessarily a functional goal that we're working towards.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of pre starting a contract makes the most sense to me, and
Hmm.
why you would do like preventative speech pathology training. The other reason you would do speech pathology preventatively would be if your day job is really speaking heavy.
Okay.
So if you're a fitness instructor, if you are some kind of teacher in an environment that is loud or whatever, if your day job while you're auditioning is very speaking heavy,
Serving,
that might
maybe I
be
would
a reason.
imagine, like
Serving,
anything.
yep,
Food
especially
industry.
serving in
Yeah.
a loud environment and stuff.
Bartending. Yeah.
That would be another reason to look at it preventatively, just because a lot of times when I have a performer who's injured, well, at least half the time, it's actually from their day job.
Yeah.
It's not even from the performing, it's from serving in a loud place and not thinking about their speaking voice at all or
Mhm.
thinking about their vocal health in that environment. So that would be the other reason to proactively meet with a speech pathologist if your day job is like that.
Yeah. I guess I like threw college into the mix as just like an example because I love that. But
Yeah.
arguably, I would imagine this is for anybody at any stage, correct? So it's like, let's
Yeah.
say I've been doing this in this, we're just going to, because we're both in New York, let's just stick with New York. I've been in New York
Totally.
for 10 years and I've decided,
Yeah.
I've been a professional performer for 10 years, or I've been hustling that, professional performance resume for 10 years, and I don't really have myself a team. I guess I want to like throw into the mix. Is it too late?
No, not, oh my God, not at
Okay.
all. It's never too late to get a team. It's also never too late to switch a team either, you
Yeah.
know? Like I have picked up a number of clients who are in their like 50s and 60s and 70s and they're Broadway veterans and they've been around the block and they just want a fresh take on their
Yeah.
voice, you know? They want a new
Yeah.
perspective on it. And so so it's never too late even to sample with somebody new or to just get a second opinion on something.
Yeah.
But it's never too late to get set up with a care team.
Yeah.
And I also don't think it's really ever too early. I mean, I think if you are thinking about going into college to do vocal performance, you probably should get a baseline scope before you go, would be my
Yeah.
advice.
Yeah.
You probably should start that your freshman year. Prior to that, unless you're having a problem, you might not need something as like a high schooler,
Mhm.
But if you're having a problem, you should get looked up. But I think by that freshman year of college, you probably should have a screening done.
Yeah. I'm gonna ask this question, then I wanna come back to, like, finding said team.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, totally.
when you are not, say, in New York or even
Hmm.
LA or a major city that has,
Yeah.
a vibrant, thriving community, and you are that vibrant, thriving person in said community, which is incredible, how are you able to find those resources perhaps while you are not in one of these major hubs?
Totally. So, well, I will say one amazing thing that came out of the pandemic, for better or for worse, is our ability to do video work.
Yeah.
So, to the extent that, like, you could be in the middle of nowhere and be working with a New York level vocal coach or voice
Mhm.
teacher, over Zoom. And Zoom or video or whatever platform you use is actually pretty good. I used to do a lot of voice therapy over Zoom during the
Mhm.
pandemic,
Yeah.
and we've gotten pretty good at it, in terms of like making it practical. I can hear most things, I can see most things. Of course, there's going to be a couple things that I just can't fully get the picture on, but you actually can get pretty good training virtually. And so I think that's at least nice from a voice teacher standpoint. In terms of like the medical side of things, I will send you this link. There is a really nice database of a voice care team locator, at least for the United States, out of
Amazing.
the University of Iowa put it together, which is amazing that they did this. And it's a really nice starting place if you're looking for a voice specialized team, because it's all self identified voice specialists, but
Okay.
most of them are laryngologists and voice specialized speech pathologists, versus general ENTs. Because if you just
Amazing.
consult with Dr. Google, you're probably going to get general ENTs that pop up the most.
Mhm.
And so this care team locator is really helpful to as a starting place. And they have it organized by state and then by city. The other option too is if none of those people are close to you or they don't take your insurance or whatever, you could also go to a general ENT as long as they do video stroboscopy, which is that extra strobe light component, and hopefully they do a long enough exam, like actually have take you up and down your range, like look at kind of speaking range, look at head voice range, have you do some singing, like as long as they get a really comprehensive exam, you can then take that video and then set up a virtual telehealth consult with a voice specialized laryngologist, send them the
Yeah.
video, and then do your appointment with them virtually, as long as they're in state, because there's state license practice laws that you have to abide to. But as long as they're in state, then you could do a telehealth consult with them, even if you got the video done with someone more local to you. So that's a really nice option too, if you're not in a major metropolitan area. But I'm kind of amazed. I mean, I think for the most part, there's a lot of states that have like incredible voice care teams that are
Mhm.
kind of unexpected. Like, for example, like Utah has some great voice care teams and
Yeah.
voice teachers, and like Arizona as well. And we don't think about those places as being like New York, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And so there's a lot of states that actually have some like really good teams. Atlanta too, and again, the
Mhm.
major metropolitan area, but at least in different areas of the country other than just the coasts.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
I love that recommendation. For people who are total newbies at it, what would and these I know these are not your
Mhm.
titles, but because you are in the world with them, like what is the functional difference between an ENT, a
Mm.
laryngologist, and a speech pathologist?
Totally. So, uh, an ENT is an ear, nose, throat doctor. The fancy term is otolaryngologist. I'm saying that like 10 times fast.
Yeah.
And your ENT, they cover ear, nose, throat. So they are trained to do your larynx theoretically and trained at least at a general level on your
Mhm.
vocal folds and larynx function. But a laryngologist is a fellowship trained ENT who has done an additional year in specifically laryngology. So they have done an additional year of training in voice, swallow, and upper airway, and that's been their major area of focus. People who are laryngologists typically they have that extra year experience, but they also have usually better equipment that's more refined, higher tech, more precise. They have more options in terms of that equipment for diagnostic purposes and also for treatment purposes. There's a lot of in office procedures actually for voice problems. And so
Mhm.
they usually have all that equipment for those in office procedures as well. They also have that extra surgical training. So if you are a professional singer and you need vocal cord surgery, I would really strongly recommend that you need to see a laryngology fellowship trained ENT rather than just a general ENT.
Mhm.
Because they're going to have that extra expertise, usually for professional singers and vocal surgery. Now, a speech pathologist is not a doctor. So that's the first biggest difference between the ENT laryngology people and the speech pathologists. Speech pathologists are not doctors. You have to have a master's of speech pathology and then completed a clinical fellowship here. But our license is under speech pathology. Like we cannot prescribe medication, we cannot technically diagnose you. And we focus on the behavioral management of a voice problem. So if the doctors focus on medical surgical management, we focus on behavioral. So we're the ones who help you make those lifestyle modifications, whether it's like, oh, we need to do modified voice rest for 2 weeks. You're going to be 50% less loud and 50% less frequently talking for 2 weeks. We kind of help make those recommendations. We design the exercise program for you in terms of doing the rehabilitative exercise to help with healing of your vocal cords. And then just in general, help you kind of plan out your vocal demands. In addition to also training speaking voice efficiency. So we'll teach you how to speak in a way that feels less fatiguing.
Yeah.
And then that's also different from a singing teacher. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of things that cross over with singing teaching, of course, like the understanding of the anatomy and physiology for a speech pathology person and a singing teacher are going to be hopefully kind of similar. But speech pathologists have a lot more of that extra experience with actually training speaking voice clinically. That is a different thing from training speaking voice theatrically. So a lot of singing
Mhm.
teachers have experience with theatrical speaking voice training and that concept, but that is a different thing than what that clinical picture looks like for day-to-day voice use. And so the
Yeah.
speech pathologist is going to have a better understanding of the varied ways that you could use your speaking voice efficiently. Yeah, so that's kind of the main difference between speech pathologist and singing teacher.
Yeah.
Of note, though, speech pathologists, not all of them specialize in voice. So it is important as a performer, if you're going to be working with a speech pathologist, you need to get with someone who not only specializes in voice, but also hopefully has a decent amount of experience with the singing voice, or at least a decent amount of exposure with the singing voice, um, because not all speech pathologists do.
Yeah. That was very, very helpful. I mean, I
Oh,
think I
good.
take for granted no, I think I take for granted the fact that, I've been doing this for a while and I have my team and, like, I just that these are things that I
Yeah,
know, and I just often have to remind
totally.
myself, like, "No, no, this is a resource for anybody starting everywhere," and
Yeah.
sometimes people will be like, "I know this, Jen, like, why?" And then other people are like, "Thank you so much because I didn't wanna ask
Yeah,
and here I am." So thank you for doing that.
totally.
Now I wanna talk about finding your team, and I wanna talk
Yeah, totally.
about it's not a one size fits all that,
Mm-mm.
but also like if you're not even sure like what it is that you're looking for versus somebody who's
Yeah,
like, I know very specifically what I need and I'm filling gaps. Like, where do we start? What is it about the human, their training, the energy,
yeah.
the structure of our time? And I guess I say this with like, I know you can't like answer for, finding maybe somebody who
Right.
isn't your people necessarily. But I think there's a misnomer around the fact that, just because there is a, say, famous voice teacher that a lot of,
Right.
say, Broadway people go
Yeah.
to, doesn't mean that that person is best for you and or your
Yeah.
voice or where you're at. But there may be a
Totally.
pressure of like, oh, well, they're supposedly the best though, and I need to do that.
Yeah.
So all of, just as everybody is swarmed with so much information, how do you sift through? What are you prioritizing? Where do you look? Why do you do this versus that? Yeah.
Totally. So, well, one thing I will say, it is interesting, especially in New York, there's definitely a crew of singing teachers who are kind of identified as like some of the major
Yeah.
Broadway singing teachers. And I think first and foremost, it's actually really helpful to know that there's like at least seven off the top of my head that I can think of. I think when I first got to New York, I thought there was like only one, and actually there's at least seven at that level, at the like highest level. They're also coaching movie productions. They're also
Mhm.
production coaches for Broadway shows. Like at the highest celebrity level or whatever, there's at least seven I could think of. So already
Yeah.
from there, there's not like there's one person in New York at the highest level.
Mhm.
And then I think that the most important thing with a singing teacher is that you leave every single lesson with 1 to 3 things that you feel like you have to work on and that make sense to you and feel relevant to your voice and feel helpful. And
Okay.
hopefully they feel specific enough and tangible enough that you know how to go home and work on them.
Okay.
So and that should be that way every single lesson.
Okay.
Of course, there's going to be moments where we feel like we have major breakthroughs and like conceptual understanding in one lesson, and then a few lessons where it feels a little less like dramatic in that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think even on those less dramatic lessons, you need to leave at least with one thing that you're thinking about. And if you're leaving a lesson not understanding what you're working on, or not even sure how to practice it at home, or that it all just still feels like some kind of mystery, that's a sign to me that it might not be the right fit because the person's not communicating with you in a way that is making it super relevant to you.
Mhm.
And so I think that concept kind of applies just to any teacher. Beyond that, I think working with people who understand the genres that you're working in and can help you understand how those genres fit in with your voice, especially with musical theater, you have to change genres and styles so often in the modern
Mhm.
industry, that finding a teacher who like is able to actually help you in your voice figure out what your voice does in those genres in a way that is predictable and repeatable is really helpful. So rather than them trying to make your voice super cookie cutter and sound exactly like this one thing, it's like
Yeah.
they recognize that it's your voice, but how does your voice fit in with these different genres? And finding that healthy balance, I think, is really important, especially in the musical theater industry. I also just like very strongly believe, and this is a personal opinion of mine,
Mhm.
I think voice teachers should be very kind. I think it should feel like a safe space. I think it should feel like a supportive space. I don't
Yeah.
think you should be afraid of your voice teacher. I don't think you should be scared to go to your voice lessons. I don't think that like that extra level of drama and scariness and fear and shame around voice teaching is such an old guard way of teaching, and it's not helpful. I don't think it actually makes you a better singer.
Well,
There was
arguably,
kind
you're
of an
you're
old,
showing
yeah,
up holding more. You're showing
right,
up with more tension. So, like, how is that in any way, shape,
exactly.
or form benefiting you?
It's
1,000%.
it's
Yeah.
not. It's not
Mhm.
helpful. It's not helpful at all. And I think there was like an old guard school of thought that if they kind of if you can sing under pressure with them, then maybe you can sing under pressure in other places. And
Uh-huh.
I disagree with that. I think your voice teacher and your voice lesson is the space to be your freest. So
Mhm.
that then when you are in a high pressure situation, you have that memory of freedom and that like reflection on that safe space that even when you don't feel safe and under a high pressure situation, you have that like supportive experience to kind of yeah support you in the background,
Yeah.
even so that when you go into these really hard pressure situations it doesn't just spiral and become like just out of control in terms of the psyche part of the voice use. And yeah, so that's kind of my take on that. I think very rarely have I ever seen fear-based training go well for a voice,
Yeah.
and it might work for a while, and someone might be able to do it for a while, but it does catch up with people eventually. And I've also seen some like really crazy manifestations of that over like a 25-year career of like it was fine for a while, but then 25 years later, someone shows up and I'm like, whoa, we have so much like weird
Yeah.
muscle tension patterns because of how much fear was put into this and also how much mystery was in it. for them because they
Yeah.
were never actually taught like anything about the anatomy, anything about the voice science of it. So everything just felt like a mystery. So if they were having a problem, they didn't know how to troubleshoot it at all. And then it became this whole psychological spiral because they weren't empowered to actually help themselves.
Yeah.
Um, so that whole power dynamic with the old guard school of voice teaching, and I think the more like new generation of voice teachers is, I think it's an interesting conversation. And it's just a
Mhm.
reminder of people that like, you don't have to work with people who don't make you feel safe.
Yeah, that part across everything really.
Yeah,
But
across
especially
everything, really.
yeah, but especially with, we're talking about as we started, just like the voice being so much part of one's identity when one is a
Totally.
performer and when you're in a space where that identity is, not feeling seen, held,
Yeah.
safe. Like having been in those situations myself, having suffered an injury in one of those kinds of
Yeah.
situations where I thought that
Yeah.
this person, because they were top, was the thing and
Yeah.
stayed, you know,
Right.
I can go into the psychological whatever of that and
Yeah.
the therapy that I needed to unpack what that
Totally.
was. But,
Yeah.
I guess I want to also wonder then when you're in these spaces, how much of it is like, I think sometimes it's like, well, I don't know enough and this person seems to know, or they've been told like
Right.
they're supposed to know. So I'm uncomfortable. How am I
Right.
clocking when my discomfort is unsafe versus when my discomfort is
Oh,
challenging?
yeah, that's so fair. Um, that's a really great question. I'm like trying to think about how to best say this. I mean, I do stand by again with what are you leaving after each lesson?
Okay.
Because as long as you're leaving with something to work on, you know you're learning something. And then you can take piece apart like, oh, is this personality fit a good fit or not for me? And if it feels tolerable enough and amicable enough, like give it a few lessons instead of just
Okay.
one sample, maybe give it a few. But if you leave and you're like, maybe I learned something, but the personality vibe was way off, like I probably wouldn't, if you could tell that it's just really off at that point, I maybe wouldn't go back. And so you can kind of gauge that out by like taking a few lessons or deciding to cut it after one. And you can also rethink about this like at any
All the
point in
time.
time,
Yeah.
at
Anytime.
all the time.
Yeah.
And I've worked with a few different teachers over the last decade, and I think I've been averaging probably like a teacher every 3 years, more or
Okay.
less. And I think I kind of find at the 3 year mark, usually I've kind of learned what I can learn from them and I'm ready for a fresh perspective. So even if it was going well for the most part and like no qualms with the person, just kind of at that 3 year mark, usually I'm ready for like a new set of ears. At
Yeah.
least that's what the trend has been, and knowing that that's also okay and like not a problem. Yeah, but it's really tricky. I think also the other really practical way to know if something's right fit for you or not is, does my voice sound better and does it feel better?
Hmm.
Because you can make something sound better, does not necessarily feel better. You can make something feel better, and then it doesn't necessarily sound better. And so, if the teacher is at least including you in that conversation, that's a collaborative teacher who is going to help guide you and help troubleshoot with you because they're including you in the conversation. If the teacher never includes you in the conversation about it sounding or feeling better or worse, that to me is kind of a red flag just because something could sound really good to them but not be feeling great to you and they're not getting your feedback, or something could be sounding like what they want you to sound like but you don't sound like what you want to sound like, and so there's kind of that disconnect. And so you want a teacher who's feels safe enough that you can actually talk to about those things and not feel like you can't bring that up in a lesson. I think that when you're in it with a teacher who makes it feel like what they say and it's that way or the highway, that's not going to be very productive very long, even if they are an amazing teacher. I just think voice is so personal, and it's so much of it is about being an artist and your musicianship and like how you want to represent yourself as a person with your voice, that you need to be included in the
Yeah.
conversation. And if you're not being included, to me, that's a red flag. I think your progress is going to be a lot slower, or it also just might not be a good fit in the first place. But even if it is kind of a good fit, the progress is going to be really slow.
Yeah. How frequently, again, I know this is an individual thing,
Yeah.
but how frequently, if one is having voice lessons, and
Hmm.
I hate the word should. So, but for the sake of this, like, what is the recommended frequency? Are you going once a month for a tune up? Are you going every week if you're trying to work on something specifically? Are you going biweekly? Is it a
Yeah.
financial thing? Like, or is it just specific for each teacher? That's like, this is the cadence that we work. Like, what am I doing?
It probably does depend on the teacher. quite a bit. I can talk about a little bit what my practice looks
Sure.
like. It's very varied because it's very person dependent.
Mhm.
I would say on average, most people come to work with me about twice a month, probably from anywhere for 3 to 6 months. After that point in time, they maybe come back once a month or as needed after that. That's about the cycle that usually people work on with me, just because my goal is to help give them enough tools so that they can coach themselves.
Yeah.
So usually if they do twice a month for 3 to 6 months, they usually are pretty, like their voice is pretty organized. They have a good set of tools to work with. They can take it out into the wild, be doing well for a while, and then maybe come back once a month for a check-in if they want to, or they can come back if they like book something and need help for something specific to prep, that kind of thing. Then it
Mhm.
can be for more of an as needed purpose. I would say on average, that's what most people look like for me. Sometimes either for availability reasons for me or for financial reasons potentially for them, we'll start off with once a month. And do something a little bit less frequent, but just do once a month, maybe of like a year and a half of just kind of that like slow and steady long term work
Yeah.
together can also be very productive. Yeah, so it can look different for different people for different reasons, but my goal for people isn't that they have to be in voice lessons forever for every 2 weeks. My goal is that like they have enough tools to go, leave, come back, and we can keep working. I think voice learning is lifelong, but you don't have to necessarily be in literally voice lessons your whole life. I think you can
Mhm.
come and go if you're being given tools that you actually understand, because then you're in charge of your voice
Yeah.
instead of that power dynamic of like the voice teacher is the only one who can tell me if my voice is going okay.
Yeah.
I like to train my clients to know, for them to know if the voice is working or not.
Yeah. What are some of these tools or resources or tricks that you are like, these would be great for you to go home with? Is it warm-ups? Is it,
Hmm.
these kinds of vocal preventative care? Like what
Totally.
are we going home with to know?
So I would say this happens kind of over time for
Mhm.
most people. There's a few different key areas. The first area that I like to give everybody is a couple muscle tension release exercises just to get them unwound. There's two that I really like, assuming they're a good fit for them in the first lesson. Tongue out trill, so that's like a raspberry.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if this will pick up on mic, so I guess we'll find out. But
Look,
it's
watch
like a
it on
lip
the
trill
YouTube
just with
video
your
for this little section. Go onto
perfect.
YouTube and just watch you do that. I love that. It's
Yeah,
gonna become a
it's like a
meme.
lip it's like a lip trill with your tongue out of your mouth,
Mhm.
essentially. That one's really good for checking tongue tension and just unwinding some initial tongue tension if that's part of the picture. And then gargling water with phonation. So like taking a small sip of water and that one's really good for addressing larynx tension. So I like to start with those two because they help kind of unwind somebody and
Yeah.
give them some really good muscular resets. So even if they don't have a ton of tongue tension when they're singing, just those muscular resets help, I think, just keep the system more relaxed and recovered in between singing. So we start there. Then once those things are unwound, I like to look at registration balance is probably a really big part of my work. So making sure that we have like really balanced chest voice, head voice, and then also all of the shades of gray in the middle and a lot of flexibility and capacity there. There's of course many things that go into training that, but that's a big bulk of my work. So like once they're kind of unwound muscularly, then we do a lot of registration work and make sure that they're really flexible throughout those registers. In their range. And then we'll also look at some point in time, usually someone shows up and they're like, I'm having kind of an off day vocally. That's the perfect opportunity
Yeah.
to then go over their how do I troubleshoot when I'm having an off day, talk about kind of some basic recovery tips on in terms of like voice rest is helpful. We probably do want to do some voice rest, but also some gentle rehab exercises like gentle straw bubbles, gentle humming, those kinds of things actually can be helpful for recovery. So kind of guiding them through that vocal health package and standpoint usually happens organically because someone just happens to show up not feeling their best at some
Yeah.
point in time. And so that kind of happens at some point as well. And then what, if someone's booked for something, then they also get a lot of vocal health guidance because then we're talking about what does that 8 show week look like or a 5 show weekend look like or whatever they're working towards. A lot of vocal health education happens, especially around that time too.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, every vocal teacher will have their own method of doing things, but I think it's helpful to hear like what might even be possible for a
Yeah.
vocal teacher to be doing with you. I think there maybe is some misnomer around like, oh, if I have a voice teacher, we're just essentially diving immediately into scales and,
Right.
and singing a song at the end, and which is all fun and games. And maybe that is what you're
Totally.
searching for. And what's
Yeah.
also might be possible is a whole other spectrum of before we even get to those things, like what are we doing?
Yeah.
Which is I think a helpful reminder that yeah, not one size fits all, but also recognizing like where you're at in your journey and what it is that you're needing and what you're wanting. Um,
Yeah, totally.
I mean, I feel like you probably have so many videos about this, and you probably talked about this ad nauseum. But while we're here, what
Yeah.
are your general like vocal health tips for like maintaining your vocal health, or some things that you're like every vocalist really does need these things? Let's not pretend that we don't, and or the opposite of
Yeah.
everyone tells you that you need this and you really don't. Stop it.
Totally, totally. Okay, my best advice is unfortunately a little bit vague, but I can give some specific examples. My best advice is you must get to know your voice very intimately. You need to know your voice and what your voice reacts to, what sets your voice up for success, what your voice likes, and you need to recheck that periodically. So it's not like, oh, I figured it out and I never have to think about it again. It's
Mhm.
no, no, you keep tabs on it and you take the data and you take the information for yourself on what makes you feel good, what makes you not feel good, and how your voice responds in various situations. For example, for myself personally, I can tolerate a lot vocally. Reflux, I can sing around it. Allergies, I can sing around it. What really screws me over is coughing. So I know that if I am coughing, if I have some kind of virus that's making me cough for like more than a week and I'm still trying to teach while doing that, I will be at a high risk for losing my voice or like having it be seriously compromised. And so I know that I more proactively need to go check in with my laryngologist if I'm coughing for more than a week so that I can dodge having it get fully lost or fully injured or having an issue that's going to last a lot longer. And that's for me personally. Other people, coughing is fine for them, but reflux like totally screws them over and they can't sing if they're having a
Yeah.
big flare up. And so it's just knowing your voice really, really personally in that way. And then it's also knowing, like, let's say you do have something like reflux, what your actual triggers are. So let's say you do have something like reflux, actually knowing like what your triggers are individually. So for me, for example, brewed coffee, no go. It really bothers my reflux, but like espresso is fine. And I was talking with someone about this the other day, and there actually is a reason for that potentially, but it's just something I've observed for my voice personally that I just really don't do brewed coffee anymore for that reason. Onions very specifically are a major problem for me too, and so I avoid those. But like pizza is fine, where
Mhm.
that's usually the typical like do not eat on the reflex list. And
Mhm.
so like getting to know yourself just really, really well in terms of that, knowing like how alcohol affects your voice. So
Mhm.
knowing if you're like a I can't drink 24 hours before a person or like a 72 hour or like a week before person, kind of understanding that. Trying to think what else. Oh, also just knowing your red flag environments. I know for me, I'm pretty good when I'm like at a bar or at a concert. Weddings, something about weddings. I just all inhibition is gone, and I am
Yeah.
screaming to Whitney Houston and
We
like
love.
micro injuring myself.
Yes,
And so
100%.
I now
Is
have
it
to be
worth it
very
though?
careful.
Maybe. Might be worth it.
It's like I could do it at 75% of that
Okay.
and still have fun and
Yeah.
not ruin my voice.
Mhm. So
And
you can
so
lip
I
sync this one
now,
instead of actually singing it.
yes,
Yeah. We know the words. Yeah.
exactly. So I think that's a red flag environment for me. So now when I do go to weddings, I am much more aware that like, yeah, I can let loose and have a number of drinks, but I just need to be mindful. Like when I'm on the dance floor, sometimes I'm lip syncing. I'm not going to scream every single song. I'm not going to just like let all inhibitions go to the wayside. So yeah, all that to say, just knowing your red flag environments too, and like
Mhm.
what really sets you off individually. That will help so much too if you are running into an issue and you go to the doctor and they're trying to collect that case history of how did we get here. You can probably give them a much clearer picture of how we got there. I've been struggling with reflux. I've had allergies because I've been on this national tour and we've been traveling to every single different state in this springtime
Mhm.
weather. I had a baby cold the other day and was coughing, and then I still had to go on though because I couldn't call out for X, Y, and Z reason. They're just going to be able to clock all of those variables that set you up for that injury, and then we can actually take care of all of those variables because you knew all the
Right.
different things that were probably contributing to that picture. It provides such a clearer picture for your care team, which is really helpful, and it makes the treatment a lot more clear cut.
Amazing. And what are some of the things that people are like, "You need to do this," and you're like, "Actually, stop it."
I think one of the big ones that comes up a lot is like water temperature. So like it
Okay.
doesn't really matter what water temperature you drink. Like it's sure warmth might feel nice and might feel soothing, and that's fine if you feel that way. But if you like ice cold water and you'll be more likely to be hydrated if you drink ice cold water, go for it. You know, as long
Mhm.
as you don't feel like it gives you some kind of brain freeze and like muscle tension thing, it probably isn't, unless
Okay.
you feel sensitive to it. So that's one that comes up a lot. Coffee is the other one where like if coffee gives you reflux, that might be a reason to dodge it. But they found that coffee is actually not really dehydrating for your vocal cords, or at least it's not dehydrating for your body. So therefore, it's likely not dehydrating for your vocal cords because it's not systemically dehydrating you, assuming you're a regular coffee drinker. So in general, that myth has been largely debunked too. Like it's fine to have some coffee. Oh, one of the other ones that's interesting is glottal fry. That one comes up a lot. It's not great to speak in glottal fry just because usually if we're speaking in glottal fry, we are constricting and straining muscles more than we need to. The
Mhm.
main risk of that is more so that it just feels fatiguing than anything. It's not like you're really necessarily injuring yourself with glottal fry. It's just it can feel fatiguing because the muscular strain. But glottal fry by itself in like a very relaxed state is actually a really relaxed way to use your vocal cords and can be used to train for voice reasons. So if someone's
Yeah.
working on vocal fold closure or a larynx that's more relaxed or more low or something, there's reasons actually glottal fry can be really helpful for your voice. And so I like to say like a 90-10 rule, especially if you speak a lot, just to avoid that vocal fatigue, that like 90% of your sentences hopefully don't have fry, and then 10% of the time it's fine.
Yeah.
And it's probably not injuring you. And so I
Yeah.
think that that understanding of glottal fry of it, it's not actually that crazy of a deal. It just can be kind of fatiguing. And if a voice teacher asks you to do fry in a lesson, it's actually probably for good reason. It's not going to hurt you.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you say would be like in a vocal starter kit or just a vocal health kit?
Yeah,
Like, what am I keeping in my
totally,
home? What am I doing on the daily? What do I have with me?
totally. I would recommend if you're a straw person, having your straws of various sizes. Straws are a great way to do semi-occlusive vocal tract exercises. And so, if you are a straw person and you like it, have your straws and your couple sizes. I would recommend having dental gauze with you in your kit because then you can stretch your tongue with your dental
Mhm.
gauze by like using it to stretch in the back. I would also recommend having some exam gloves if you are into jaw myofascial release or also like some soft palate massage work. Those exam gloves can be helpful to have on hand. Some kind of topical hydration, at least at home, would be good. So whether that's steaming or nebulizing. And then they make
Can you
more
just stop for a
portable
second?
versions of
What
that
for
too. Oh
people
yeah.
is the difference between that? Because I think no one really talks about that.
hmm I'm going to speak with my opinion on this one.
Okay.
I don't believe there is a comparison study. I could be wrong, so someone can fact check me on that. If I'm wrong, please let me know. But I do not believe there is a comparison study between nebulizing and steaming in either the same people or in some kind of like control
Mhm.
group, double blinded something. So anytime someone says use steaming for this and use nebulizing for this, it's not really something we can say with 100% black and white confidence because we don't have that comparison study to say that necessarily. So I argue that it's down to personal preference.
Okay.
There are some things that might be nice about one or the other that we theorize. For example, steaming, it's warm. And so that might help if you run muscularly tight. The warmth of the steam might feel nicer to you than the nebulizers are usually a cool mist vapor. And so
Mhm.
that might be one reason you prefer steaming. They theorize that the nebulization particles, I think because they're smaller, maybe go deeper. And so maybe that hydration level is deeper than steaming. But again, we don't necessarily have that comparison study, so it's hard to say. And so again, I think most of it comes down to personal preference. I recommend trying both and then making that decision yourself, essentially.
Okay. How long should one be steaming and or nebulizing on the daily or weekly or day? What are we doing?
Great question. So the frequency will depend on the person. Some people need to do it every day. Some people need to do it seasonally in the winter. Some people need to do it every day when they're on tour, but they don't need to do it otherwise. You know, so it kind
Mhm.
of just depends frequency wise on where you're at in life. For length of time, nebulizing is usually 15 minutes. And the commercial grade voice ones are usually set up to be a 15-minute thing automatically. For steaming, I would say probably anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. And and making sure that the steam is not too hot. We don't want the steam to be like so hot that it actually feels kind of irritating, you know? So
Mhm.
just making sure that the steam is not set up to like the highest heat setting, but maybe like somewhere in the middle is probably a sweet spot. And then, oh, also humidification, just in general, is helpful. So having a humidifier in your home or in your dressing room can be a way to also keep your environment a little bit more moist.
And are you doing this with cold air humidifiers, I'm assuming?
Usually that's what I have recommended
Yeah.
historically. Yeah, but I don't know that there's necessarily like a widely accepted clinical standard for that. I usually
Okay.
recommend Cool Mist is fine.
Mhm.
There's actually one that I like that's called Canopy, and it's more of a filter situation. And so I think from a cleaning standpoint, it's a little bit easier. And that's the other thing, big thing with steamers, humidifiers, and nebulizers. You have to be really good about cleaning them because it's your airways, and you don't want to get infected or anything like that from these products. As another side note for nebulizing, you do need to get clearance from a doctor if you have any history of pulmonary conditions, because you might be at more risk if there is a problem with your nebulizer of getting an infection. So that is just a side note ethically that you need
Yeah.
that clearance if you've had previous pulmonary conditions.
How often are you exchanging or changing your actual machinery? Like I've had
Oh, good
like when
question.
I do my steamers and you start to see that it like, oh, we get not like rust and I'm cleaning it often, but like it's still like the
Yeah,
base of it.
totally.
What are we doing with that?
That's a great question. So in general, the steamer that I have at home is one of those ones that's just like a plate.
Mhm.
And so it's pretty easy to keep it clean because it's not like it's pipes running through anything. I think the things that get a little bit more hairy are the things that have little pipes that are hard to clean inside them. So like humidifiers can get that way, for example.
Yeah.
Which is kind of why I like the Canopy one, just because it has that changeable filter and then like the other parts are dishwasher friendly and stuff like that. So from a cleaning standpoint, it seems easier. And so yeah, for the steamers that are just the plate, I think that could last you actually a very long time as long as you keep it dry once you're done using it. To be honest, funnily enough, with like the vocal nebulizers and stuff, a lot of times they break after a while. So
Yeah.
even I'm not actually sure what the cleaning like when you should replace it because usually within a year or two they're busted anyways, and so you're going to be buying a new one regardless.
Yeah.
So for that, it kind of takes care of itself.
Yeah.
But I'll keep you posted if I learn something
Yeah.
different about
Is
that.
there anything else in my toolkit? Like what else am I keeping?
Yeah, totally. So we have straws, we have gloves, we have dental gauze, we have some kind of topical humidification. Oh, non-menthol lozenges. So cough drops that do not have menthol in them. Menthol in general can feel drying or cooling, and that cooling sensation can actually be kind of irritating to the vocal folds, and also be kind of addictive. So that extent, we in general don't recommend menthol lozenges. Usually we want something like pectin or glycerin as the ingredient. So
Okay.
Luden's wild cherry, something with slippery elm is totally fine. That is good to have on hand. I think that those are the main things that you would want to have on the go with you. Yeah,
Okay.
because you have your stuff for like manual work, you have your straws in case you're a straw person. You have your lozenges. Yeah, and if you do bring your mist stuff to go, just having your saline packets, that would probably be the one other thing. Like if you bring a nebulizer with you, just make sure you have the extra packets as well.
Yeah. Um I this was so we bounced, but we covered. We bounced and
Yeah.
covered, and I'm really, really grateful for how willing you were to just go on that journey and how giving you
Thanks.
were of these various resources. I will steal that like link from you and I will put it
Oh,
in
yes, totally.
our show notes. But I'm so grateful for you showing up in this way. And
Thanks.
I know for a fact that this is a conversation that will be really, really helpful for so many of our artists.
Thanks.
So thank you for that. For
No
anybody who wants
problem.
to work with you, find you, follow you, what within your boundaries is the best way for people to reach out?
Totally. So the best way to contact the studio is through the studio website, which I can give you the link for. That studio site's great. We have a contact form, and I actually have a number of associate teachers who work under me as well. And we have a bunch of different specialties. Like we have a guy who now specializes in scream technique and vocal growls and how to do that safely. And we have a mind body wellness coach too, who helps with performance anxiety and personal training, in addition to then just our other singing teachers in the studio. So
Amazing.
there's a lot of different ways to work with us, which is fun. And so the studio website's the best for that. In terms of just connecting on like the educational content that I post, I'm probably the most active on Instagram, which is
Mhm.
Vocal Health SKB. And I post a lot of educational tips and tricks on that page. And you won't be able to catch me through DM that way, but at least in terms of if you want additional education, that's the place to find that additional education from me.
I love it. Thank you so much for being here.
No problem. Thank you for having me. It was really fun to talk about all of this.